Hello, everyone. I am Ming. I'm a director on the board of CEDA. Welcome to CEDA's live stream addressing the gender wealth gap. Ahead of International Women's Day, we've come together to look at the social and policy solutions required to close the gender wealth gap in Australia. CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. Committed to reconciliation and recognition, we respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. Representing just 3% of Australia's population, they cannot change what we think of them. It is up to the rest of us to educate ourselves and to reconcile the privilege that has been afforded to us to their detriment. We acknowledge their grace of always welcoming us and their custodian of this great country from which we can learn much. Today, as at all CEDA events, you can interact through our Q&A portal, which is available via the link on your screen, or you can enter in the details by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode WealthGap. Post your own questions and vote on the questions submitted by others. You can put forward your questions at any time and we will endeavour to answer as many of them as possible during the allotted time. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using today's hashtag, which is gender wealth gap, and by tagging at CEDA_news. So let's talk about money. Money has no values. That comes from you and me. But money transmits power. And we want women to be as powerful as men in this country, not more and not less. The gender wealth gap is intergenerational and at every generation it gets worse. And I want to explore this issue today. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those leading this important discussion, Dr. Entsar Hamid, General Manager, Government and Stakeholder Engagement and Registry Services, SERV, and Board Chair at Gender Equity Victoria. Eliza Owen, Head of Residential Research Australia at CoreLogic. And Professor Alison Preston, Professor of Economics at the University of Western Australia. We will try to weave in as many of the audience Q&A through the allotted 50 minutes of the panel discussion. Viewers of the live stream can submit their own questions and vote on the others through our app Pigeonhole. So the first question I have for you is to Alison. There seems to be a stigma for women to aspire to make a shared load of money. To talk about making money, to ask about making more money. As an example, the number of women doing economics at university has fallen through the floor. Am I wrong?
No, unfortunately, Ming, you're not wrong. But before I actually commence my answer to your question, can I just thank the opportunity to be on this panel and acknowledge that I'm sitting on lunar land here in Western Australia. So to return to your question, yes, unfortunately, it's a real concern for a number of us for so many reasons, that the numbers of people studying economics generally has fallen through the floor, and with that, the rate of decline of women taking on economics has really gone. And the Reserve Bank has actually got a programme of research to try and arrest this decline and understand what's behind it. And a big part of what's behind it is what's been happening in the schools and the fact that there's a lot more competition for ATAR subjects, and economics is obviously just seen as being less attractive when you've got other subjects like psychology and law and whatever else to study alongside it. But coming back to your first question, there's a concern, or not so much a concern, but why is it that women don't seem to have the same motivation? I've forgotten how you worded your question, but in terms of wealth accumulation, to talk about money. And I think that just actually goes very much back to culture. And you'll hear from my accent that I'm from Scotland, and I know we get ribbed a lot in Scotland about the fact that we're supposedly mean and we're penny pinching, and it's certainly going true back in time. I'm a product of two parents that were war babies, and so penny pinching was important. But part of that meant that we had a lot of conversations in the household about money. And so in Scotland, we talk about money. In England, you don't talk about money. So there's big cultural things that go behind that. And so those conversations that start young lead forward. And so I think a big part of what the answer to your question is very much imbued in culture. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we go through today.
So if I just talk about that first question about women making more money, other than talking to our daughters much earlier about making money, and it's actually quite important for you to make money to be able to survive financially, what else do we need to do to change or address that cultural bias we have for women just to not talk about these things?
Well, I mean, I think that whole culture of things comes back down to a whole lot of stuff that we have to do. It's not just to have them talk about money, but it's had to actually have them talk about how do they make decisions? How do we make decisions about work? How do we make decisions about how we're going to divide up resources within households? And a lot of that comes back down to education. And I think we're actually seeing the narrative change a lot. It's even changing a lot right now in terms of how we call things out. So, I mean, right now, the top of my mind is Brittany Higginson, just the fact that we're actually starting to have much open conversations in society about a lot of this stuff. So I was actually just listening to Life Matters this morning, and Wendy McGrath was on, just listening to the fights that those women had to go through for us in terms of their feminist struggles. It's never going to end, and the agenda keeps on shifting. And I think what we need to do is to actually recognise that this agenda that it never ends, and we have always got new battles that we're going to have to fight, just keep making sure that we've got those lists on there, and that we're moving forward with them, and that we don't see a retreat, which is easy to see a retreat in this regard.
Yep, so it's constant vigilance.
A nice way to put it.
Dr. Entsar, can I come to you? One of the blinding moments in my self-reflection was when I was thinking of this. I have a son and a daughter, and I was, thinking about, would I be as proud of my son if he became a stay-at-home dad versus my daughter if she decided to be a stay-at-home mum? And it was just, sort of the blood draining from my face. And here I am advocating for greater gender equality, but even I had to work against the expectations that I've been taught, and those cultural expectations are just so strong. If we expect to have, if we just expect that our daughters are going to be carers at home and our sons are going to be the breadwinners at work, do we just not perpetuate gender equality from our homes into our workplaces? And what can we do about this?
Yeah, I think that's right. Ming, as much as I love to be called doctor, I don't have a doctorate. So you can keep calling me that you can keep calling me that if you like, but and I'll accept it. But I just want to make sure that for the record, that's not the case. I also want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, which is where I'm joining this call from today. And I think you make a really, really valid kind of point and ask the question, and ultimately unconscious bias it's neurological. Quite a lot of what we're talking about today is systemic. It's not, kind of localized. And the kind of change that we're talking about, kind of shifting that thinking, isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to happen over a long period of time. I always like to look at kind of the macro picture before I start talking about the micro. And I guess the World Economic Forum has done a lot of research on this, and globally there is a global gender development index that ranks countries based on their performance against pay and other things. And One of the things that strikes me regularly when talking to people, any individual about gender, is that there's a lack of information or understanding about it. We don't see anyone being harmed, and so we don't think there's an issue to resolve. But Australia definitely falls number 44 on that Gender Development Index. It used to be at number 15, and we've fallen from 15 to 44 in a period of 14 years. So, Alison was talking about regression and moving backwards. It can happen very quickly. That's far less than a generation of time to kind of go back there. And in terms of kind of our own unconscious biases or the cultural impacts of gender roles or gender norms, or kind of feeding the, what should girls do versus what should boys do, that definitely happens across all cultures. That's both Western and in developing nations. I have 2 sons and a daughter. I have a conversation all the time, and my boys are now quoting me, parroting me, and they think they're probably mocking me, but I think the ends justifies the means at the end of the day. We definitely have a shortage of girls in STEM. We have a shortage of girls or anyone who identifies as female going into maths, or, accounting, science, economics. Those sectors are male dominated. And so I think a lot of work has to happen in schools at the primary school or primary education, and even at kinder, to start to break down those biases and help us stop contributing or perpetuating those stereotypes. I'm Northeast African, from Eritrea, and women generally become very well educated and then become stay-at-home moms. And in my mind, that's a huge waste of kind of talent and knowledge. And the Victorian state government's done research, and the unpaid kind of carer labor workforce is worth about $206 billion to the economy. So these are pretty staggering numbers. Participation is critical, and we can increase participation if we stop thinking about girls as being mums and then being stay-at-home, or kind of needing to work part-time because they have children. And if we start to split the unpaid carer duties between men and women equally, we'll have more of a chance of doing that. So at the moment, 80% of unpaid carer work is undertaken by women, and 19% and change is done by men. And that's stats from 2-parent households, over 60% of which have 2 working parents in them. And so if we talk about, the impact of time off work and the impact of not having time generally on your participation, there's a huge impact there. And we all have a responsibility to do something to address it. And I think it starts at a very young age.
Can I just challenge one thing, though, just even in that conversation, it really, this is the piece that troubles me out of COVID, that, I would have thought in COVID, we really got to understand the value of care, the value of our nurses and teachers and all these people who are essential to our lives. Why is it that we still, talk about, yes, they're sort of, women are moving into STEM and, these are male-dominated areas. Does it actually mean we need to pay our care industries better, our nurses and teachers, our aged care workers, which so happen to have, a greater proportion of women working in them? Is it just as fundamental? Is it that we just don't value care enough? Entsar?
Yeah, it would be really hard for anyone to say no to that as an answer. Absolutely. I think ultimately income, compensation package, remuneration is an indicator of value. And if we're paying these roles less, if we were paying these sectors less, then we are definitely giving out the message that those functions, those roles are worth less to us as a society. Unfortunately, we all need access to them. And so, yes, COVID has really shined a light at, how that inequity doesn't make sense for us from a societal perspective. And of course, we were talking about the impact of culture and cultural norms. Looking at the kind of the intersectionality piece, sorry, Ming, so migrant women are 7% less likely to be employed than Australian women. So, we've got kind of levels of inequity and disadvantage within disadvantage. And I guess the other thing is, again, if I go back to being Northeast African, the African community in Victoria has an unemployment rate of almost 45%. And a lot of the unemployment is amongst men, ironically, and a lot of the women work in these lower paid, insecure roles, so aged care, nursing, those sorts of roles. If if we start to think about how complex all of this is, you've got the inequity piece that's related to your migration status or your kind of ethnic status, and 56% of Australians have at least one parent who was born overseas and speaks another language. 44% of Australians have two parents who are in that boat. And so we're talking about quite a lot of people who are impacted by what is quite a systemic and institutional issue.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about intersection a little bit more because that's one of my pet topics I always like to bring up everywhere. But, back to my original comment, it's money transmits power. And if we actually are not, even after COVID, recognising that these care industries or, including teachers and all of these sort of professions that are so critical to our lives, if we actually do not recognise the power they should have after this, I wonder when we will recognise their importance. But certainly the value of caregiving actually needs to be elevated, I think, just generally more within our society. Eliza, can I come to you? Because home ownership is one of the greatest potential wealth transfer mechanisms. And it also provides financial security, right? So, if I already own my home, I can potentially take more risks. I can survive crises such as COVID. We just talked about the fact that we've got many women who work in these lower paid industries such as childcare, hospitality. How the heck do we get them on the property ladder? And do you see that these female-dominated industries have lower rates of home ownership?
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me, and also just want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's a really interesting lens looking at home ownership and gender. And I think CoreLogic has really just tried to scratch the surface of this research with the data that's been available to us. So we see that in our inaugural report last year, we reported ownership rate of 26% of real estate owned by women compared to over 29% in men. And importantly, the biggest or the most common kind of home ownership was that sort of 44% owned jointly by men and women observed through our data as well. So I think when you look at some of the characteristics around ownership that are more rigorously understood, it really comes back to things like income as a signifier. If we look at earnings, income quintiles over time, back in the 1980s, home ownership rates were, fairly equal among different income quintiles, and that's changed dramatically among different age cohorts. People in the lowest income quintiles have the lowest access to home ownership. Now, as you say, that's a problem because home ownership has implicitly become an important pillar of retirement. We know Australians have about 56% of their wealth held in the housing asset, and it can be the difference between a comfortable retirement and a retirement of poverty. If you're in that stage of your life where you're retired, you've got less money coming in, the way that our housing system is set up, you want to make sure that you own outright so that you don't have those exorbitant housing costs. So this is not just a question of how do we equalise that ownership of property, but it's also a question of how do we ensure that those vulnerable groups who don't go on that home ownership journey are covered on a lower income level, are covered in retirement, and are not put in vulnerable positions. And I think it's important to note that our analysis was looking at a snapshot of ownership as it stands today. So it's possible that there's a lot of legacy in that as well, where, 40 or 50 years ago, it was more common for men to be the kind of purchasers of housing through their participation in the labour force and that sort of thing. So, I think that that has implications for older Australians in particular, in terms of what happens at the end of if a partnership dissolves or whatever, and what happens in ownership then. So as well as getting more women into home ownership, there's probably a question around legal protections and things like that come from home ownership as well. And then in terms of actually trying to get women into the property market, we've seen higher incidences of female property ownership in, areas where more women are represented in the workforce. So women have the lowest ownership rates in areas where, men are sort of overrepresented in highly compensated industries like mining, construction. We see that in regional WA, where women own about 20% of real estate and men have ownership of almost 30%. So there is, probably a link to empowerment through income, the status of women in jobs in various areas as well. And I guess at a very basic level, you could say that with the gender wage gap as well, the lower the wage you're on, the longer it's going to take you to save up your 20% deposit, unless you have access to intergenerational wealth, which, is another big consideration in this story as well.
Yeah. Pay is such a fundamental root solution as well as cause of this gender wealth gap, right? Is it as simple as ensuring, for example, in Australia, we have universal early learning, education and care so that, access to enable women to get back to work, or is it, as easy as ensuring that women who are predominantly part-time as well, right, have better wage protections or just incentives so that we equalise the gender pay gap so that we can attack the gender wealth gap? Eliza?
Yeah, you make a really good point. I think addressing gender pay gaps and also pay gaps in some of those intersectionalities that we've already talked about on the panel as well would really help. But you make a really interesting point about the role of housing contributing to the cause as well as kind of being seen as a solution. With the upswing that we've seen where property prices have come up around 25% since COVID, that's created a greater inequality between the haves and have-nots. So, yeah, you have to look at it holistically. It's not just necessarily about trying to ensure we have the right rates and numbers of home ownership, but maybe we need to look at how do we actually view home ownership and how financialized should it be and how much of a role should it play in that income, wealth security as well, I think is a really important question. But and absolutely looking at it from a wage perspective as well is very important.
Yeah. Entsar, sorry. Yes, please interrupt.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Eliza said, but I would love to add that more and more we're having a discourse around family violence, domestic violence, and the impact that has on women. Many women leave a domestic violence situation and forfeit their kind of financial and property ownership rights in that process. And a lot of that is around accessibility of legal advice. Or even being able to afford legal advice, being able to want to, take up that fight, and then kind of starting all over again from that perspective. 35.5% of Victorians are single people. 50% of those are women. It takes them, 90 months to save up for a deposit when it takes men 78 months to be able to do that sort of thing. But again, KPMG did a study, and they found that 27% of the gender pay gap is associated with time off work, associated with having children. And we're now seeing that, that leads to less super, that leads to less kind of wealth accumulation over your lifespan. And then ultimately, we're now seeing that women over 50 are at highest risk of homelessness now in Australia. And all of these things are so intricately linked together. And there's a lot that could be done in one area or another. But if you don't, again, look at the entire picture and do something more holistic to tackle the systemic issues that are in place, then it's never mind closing the pay gap. We're talking about closing the wealth gap, which will take generations and generations to do, if indeed it can be done, because ultimately, as Eliza said, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is already growing. And if the median income's, $45,000, $49,000 per annum, and a house in Melbourne costs $1.2 million or so, then we're talking about a situation where, as a society, more and more people are going to be disadvantaged. And then, of course, women form more than half of that subset.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right in terms of, if we actually, in every generation, we don't address it and actively address it, we're just entrenching that inequality. I do want, it's a really great segue into, I want to talk about super now. And I have to confess, I had my nephews and nieces, so they'd be, under 25, over the talk about financial management, right? And the superannuation came up, and you can just see their eyes glaze over because it's so damn complicated. But it's also so important to actually start saving early so we can get them into the compounding benefits, right? Alison, how do we get women more interested in super early? And what do we need to do to the superannuation system to ensure it actually better supports women? Because I always imagine when it was created, it's probably, a room full of men thinking, hey, this is a great system. And there probably weren't any women in the room thinking, this might not work for women. So what can we actually do to our superannuation system to get women interested more early and to make it actually more equitable for women in the first place?
Thanks very much, Ming. Maybe I could just also pick up on some of the things you just said in the last question there about pay rates as well. And for some of them, and I, I absolutely agree with that. Everything that's been said, and Entsar's right. If we're focused on trying to close the gender pay gap, which of course we should for many other reasons. As you come back to money is power. But even if we were to close that gap, as far as superannuation goes, and our modelling shows, it would increase. It would narrow the gap. It would reduce the gap by around 38%, but we would still see, this is for current group of people who are not retired, we'd still see a 20% gender gap in superannuation balances, even if women had the same average lifetime incomes and the same workforce attachment, because of a big part of the penalty comes from having children, time out of the workforce, and therefore contributions. And there are other models that we could look at, in the Scandinavian countries, for example, time out of the labour market doesn't see a stop in contributions, which is why they obviously advocate for having people who are on government-funded paid parental leave to be able to have ongoing contributions. But that's only going to narrow it at the margin. It comes back to the main points that have been made, that there are structural problems here. And at the end of the day, superannuation benefits those who have got high income and have continuous attachment to the workforce in a high way. And that we know is not characteristic of women. And so, you come back to how do we get women to engage with superannuation at an early age? Obviously, APRA doing a lot of work in that area, and I obviously don't know who's participating in this panel today, but I would be surprised if there wasn't someone from APRA there. And so they've been doing a lot of work to actually try and put forward, products that might basically stop the vulnerability of people in the superannuation system that we've got. And My Super is a big part in this regard. Being able now from the last election, the last budget there, changes to be able to have the superannuation accounts follow people as they change jobs, really important because of the multiple jobs and changes that women have, and efforts to help consolidate their accounts are also really important. But I think fundamentally, it comes back down to recognising that superannuation is as much as the system was designed to help improve incomes in retirement, and for many it will, the age pension is ultimately going to be the most important part of the retirement income system. And any idea that we're going to see, superannuation replace the age pension is just, it's false. And so I think, right now we actually see a lot more government concessions going into superannuation. There is more money spent by government in taxation concessions for superannuation than there is on the age pension. And, that is wrong. Because we know, and I am one that benefits from it, but the taxation concessions benefit the high income earners. And we've now actually, for many reasons we've just discussed, seen a much bigger wealth gap forming there. So, how do we get them to engage, young women to engage in the superannuation? It's the same reason, it's the same answer. How do we just get them to engage in financial literacy anyway? And how do we get them to engage in managing the money? And in that regard, I think superannuation is actually a really useful vehicle, even if it's a vehicle to have them start to understand that there are long-term financial decisions that they have to think about. I've got 3 sons, and we have lots of conversations about them. They're a bit like what Entsar was saying, a broken record, and one day they might actually think about what was Mum trying to say later on. But, regularly I'm at I actually know that all 3 of them took the money out of raided their superannuation accounts during 2020 when they could, when COVID was there. And for some reasons, I actually understand why they did it. For various reasons, they lost their jobs, lost their incomes. They didn't want to be coming to me. I didn't want them to come to me either. And so down the track, they will anticipate, they hope that they'll have, money's more important to them now, basically, than it is for later. And that goes for a lot of young people. But what superannuation accounts do is actually get them to actually understand that there's another savings there. And it fascinates me. I teach economics, I teach first-year students as well as MBA students, and even with the MBA students, they don't know how much superannuation's in their account. They don't know what kind of accounts they've got. They don't know what their employer's paying into their accounts. So when you start to have these conversations with them and say, look, this is your money. And we know already right now that if we look at the last national wage case decision, that the Fair Work Commission deliberately held back some of what they otherwise would have given as a wage increase because they knew that employers were going to be paying more through superannuation. So we know that this would have otherwise been to us as a wage, and it's now going into superannuation. It's their wages. Ultimately, I think this comes back down to a lot of conversations. So I'm glad there is. I think superannuation has been a fantastic initiative. It's been brilliant for Australia. We've now got the I've forgotten how many trillions we've got, whether it's $3 trillion worth of superannuation and savings there, but we're the 5th largest in the world in terms of our pool of monies there. So that's obviously going to support, one hopes, a lot of consumption demand in the future. A big debate on inequality in terms of who's got the marginal propensity to consume, which is a different debate from this one in some ways. But so superannuation is really important, and I think APRA are doing a great job to actually try and protect the incomes of low people and try and find different ways for them to get to to engage in it. And there's some great, I'll just finish up in here, there's, and maybe we can put some links up after CEDA to some of the initiatives that are out there. In Western Australia, we've got Financial Toolbox, and they're doing some fantastic, not-for-profit organisation, fantastic work in the community with women to help them understand their money management. And the ABC have got a nice programme right now. Emily Stewart has got quite a lot of work that she's, and initiatives as well there to try and help people talk about money and understand their money.
I mean, there's so many things in there, Alison. Just one little quick thing before I come to you, Entsar. Do you have any stats about, you talk about your sons taking out money from their super. Do we know how many women took their money out of super versus men, or can answer that question? So who can answer that question on the panel?
Look, I'm happy to have a first go, and I'm curious to see what the others have to say as well, because ultimately I think, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about this later, there is a paucity of data. It's really, really hard to get any decent data to. We've got the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, does a nice regular series on wages, mostly on full-time earnings, which is ironic, since the majority of women work part-time, so it's really quite hard to get any data on part-time earnings, but that's on the side. But it's a regular series. It used to be quarterly. Now the 602 comes out on a biannual basis. But we've got data, and we can track what's happening over time. There is, the latest data on superannuation from the ABS is from 2007 to 18. There is a series that they put out December 21 on personal income, and I was looking there for superannuation data, and that goes back to 18 to 19. So they do their best. APRA's got data, but it only has the data on its member accounts, and some people might have multiple member accounts, so we don't necessarily know what the individual has. We can only see what that member accounts data is, and they will put out their various reports. But you do find yourself sifting through and making assumptions and aggregating here and there. And so to come back to your question, who took the money out or not, my observation from the APRA data, but we'd love if APRA could actually come back in and put some statements out to confirm this a bit more, is that it was younger people, more than older people, who took the money out, and of the younger group, proportionately more men took money out than younger women. But when I've looked at the average account balances of members, there's actually been a dip in the average account balances of women, which suggests that maybe, because I don't know how much, whether men took out more than women, so men might have gone to the pool more than women, but perhaps women took out more than men. I don't know. And in fact, just to finish up, coming back to your Esther's point about financial literacy and domestic violence, a statistic that I read in the Financial Review, and I've forgotten where it came from, but I read it in the Fin Review, was something like 70,000 women were coerced to take their money out through that, which is just, even as I say that statistic to you right now, I've got chills going down the back of me as well. So, I don't know.
It's shocking. I just find it shocking we do not have data where we know these are issues, because at least if you have the data, you could actually, hopefully cut it down so that it would be useful for policy and to address some of these problems so we don't make it intergenerational.
Could I just one more quick comment on this, and maybe we can talk more about it as well. I have a few colleagues here in Western Australia. Siobhan Austin's one that comes to mind right now, and they're doing quite a lot of work on what happens with in-house households as well, because what happens with superannuation is we know that the government sees, this is the pot of money for the couple, and so we've obviously had the Senate inquiry report, husband's not on a retirement income plan, but at the end of the day, the tax concessions and blah, blah, blah is to help equalise it up so that there's a couple. But there is nothing in there that says that, most of the people who leave see this as my superannuation account, my money. And so there is nothing in there in retirement that protects so let's just say the majority of the money is going to be with men. We know that is the case. There's nothing that has anything about how do they make decisions and how do they provide for the spouse, particularly given the longevity of women over men. And so, again, to think that superannuation is necessarily a solution to women's inequality in old age, again, is quite problematic, because even if they go into old age with potential access to a pot, they are, again, this income is power. I think you've said that a few times, and I like it. I think this sums up the whole thing. Money is power, and they still don't have power in those relationships and assets to that money.
Yeah, this was the exact question I was going to ask Entsar, because in my household, I was the primary income earner, but it was hours. It was out, like I don't know what it is. In my mindset in our house, it was our super. So we equalised all the way through, even when I had my kids, even when my husband was at home, we have equal super. Is it as, because we don't have the information about how households think of it, is it as important to, can you make people equalise their super when they're in these relationships? Can't. But some, I sort of feel like that's some of the discussions that we need to have, so that we don't get into a situation where, in the domestic violence situation where you have that disproportion, then the women have to go and fight to get their super. When we don't have, women, the divorcing later, we get the situation of women who are homeless but they had potential access to that super. How do we address that in a household, Entsar? And is it a case of rethinking full-time, part-time work and how that interacts with the super system as well? Come on, Entsar, yes. Solve it for us.
Okay. No pressure at all. So I guess a couple of things. We absolutely need access to more secure part-time work. Because a lot of part-time work is insecure. It's casual. It doesn't attract enough super. It doesn't attract benefits, including all the leave and allowances. And when we talk about pay parity and that pay gap, we're not only talking about your salary, we're talking about contribution to your super. We're also talking about professional development, all of the discretionary allowances, bonus payments, incentives, et cetera. The whole kind of compensation package should be looked at when you're doing that analysis. To close off the piece around super and accessing super during COVID, women did access it in far greater numbers to men. And that was for a couple of reasons. One, because 67% of part-time workers in insecure work are women. And then the other reason is because the way that the job seeker payments were paid, they were paid to people who were in paid full-time or paid employment over a certain threshold of hours for the 12 months prior to COVID. And so if you did less hours than that, or you were on maternity leave, or you could no longer access that. And so what was the safety net that would keep you kind of afloat or help you manage mortgage stress? It was your super, the kind of your contribution to your super fund there, I guess, for one point. The other thing is, yes, we need like a secure structure around part-time employment. It's not part of a lot of awards or EEA agreements, which is ironic because the sort of work that women do in childcare and aged care and kind of hospitality, those are award roles. They've got pay and kind of allowance packages around them, but because they're insecure and they're not legally required to be more secure, there's like a perverse kind of outcome that occurs there. So that's kind of the why of it. The what we do to change things, again, is really tricky. There have to be some policy provisions around part-time work, around compensation and security of part-time work, and that work needs to be treated the same as full-time employment. And how we do that, I think, is quite complex. It is something the federal government really needs to lean into and weigh into. A lot of what I heard in the conversation with Alison is around the fact that there's very little data in Australia. That is a known problem and issue. It was something like 2006 when the federal government stopped collecting data and information around the unpaid care kind of economy. And then you've got the ABS or census that happens, in these long kind of lead times and cycles. And that data in aggregate doesn't really fully tell the picture that helps us solve this. And then we kind of go back to the fact that you measure what you value and you value what you measure, and then you can only track monitoring and performance against that if you measure it. And what we have seen the federal government do with First Nations people is, start their initiative around closing the gap. And, there's going to be a really unacceptably long lead time to ensuring that First Nations people have equity in the way that they deserve it as traditional owners of these lands. But at least we're counting, measuring, monitoring performance, and we understand how far we've got to travel. And then we can start to put action plans in place and do those sorts of things. We don't have quotas. We don't have metrics, performance metrics in place. So we haven't since 2006. And I think that's where you have to start. You have to start by setting targets and measuring and monitoring performance against those targets. Yeah, the cost to our GDP is too high not to do that.
Yeah, I just feel like we need more women in these decision-making roles for our entire financial system, so that women, I love the fact that you bring up intersection of women to First Nations women, women with a disability, women of colour. We always expected, as we advocated for greater gender equality, it was going to trickle down to everyone. We know it hasn't. And if anything, it's actually gotten worse for some of these groups. So, having people in decision-making roles to try and put in policies urgently to address it so it doesn't become worse is actually quite important. Eliza, can I come to you? One of the interesting things as I was speaking to my nephews and nieces about home ownership for them, because it just felt like it was completely out of reach and they were never going to get there, that there's obviously provision within the superannuation system for the First Home Savers scheme. And what was interesting is that they really saw that as a huge potential benefit to help them get to ownership. And I wondered why we hadn't expanded that to broader. Can we get the superannuation system to invest not just our super money, but our broader savings? Because interest rates are so low, and they would think, when they're asking us, well, what do we invest in? I can only put in so much into the super for the first home owners grant. Does that savings scheme, can it be extended so that younger people can use the skills that exist in our superannuation system to grow their wealth as well?
I mean, I think that's a great question. One of the things that strikes me about that scheme and some of the initiatives around building wealth for home ownership, accessing various grants, and they're quite complex. And I think that some of these schemes are, you have to know about them. You have to understand how they work. And sometimes if you don't come from a better or a higher income household that already has all of that kind of financial knowledge ingrained, then that can be a barrier in itself.
Yes.
Somewhat ambivalent about the contribution of super for the purchase of a first home. I understand that those being able to access their super for it would, be better off than otherwise. But ultimately, it is another demand side policy, and these are parts of the policies that have created a strong upswing in housing values. So it is tricky. We've seen more targeted policies like the family home guarantee, which, even though it was targeted at all single parents within this certain income threshold, it was a relatively small scheme, but you'd hope that would disproportionately benefit women as the majority of single parent households being women as well. So, there are some things that you can implement, and I think perhaps more targeted schemes, particularly around wealth and income. For example, the first home loan deposit scheme, the income threshold for that seemed a little high to me. A cap of 125,000 on a single income earner, which puts you in the 80th percentile of income earners. Which we know would have a much better chance of home ownership anyway. So I think targeting those kinds of schemes, making them easy to understand, and I've just been sitting here as well, so enjoying the discussion. There are things that I wrote down and wanted to add, but one thing that I did want to bring up was just around the psychology of engaging women in conversations about finance and economics as well. Just one anecdotal thing that I wanted to contribute was that I studied economics in high school, university, absolutely love it as a study. I didn't know what it was, and I wouldn't have known what it was if I didn't actually have a teacher come to me in high school and say, I see that you're interested in X, Y, Z. I think you'd be really good at economics. I didn't know what it was, thought it was kind of a financy thing, didn't think it was for me. The fact that my school had the resources that teachers could, really support their students in that way. I was in a very privileged environment, which really helped. But just being conditioned by a teacher, by an authoritative figure, to think that I could engage with this subject was so helpful for me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, talking to my nephews and nieces, I think that's come up a few times with respect to super is how damn complicated it is. It's just you need a degree to almost engage with it. And that already will just be a barrier to entry, right? And so, to me, it was all around all these terms. Like, I'm in the finance industry, so I sort of get the terms, but even sometimes I find it hard. But, how do we actually make sure that as an industry, we make it simpler for people to use and understand? Entsar, your solution.
Teach it in schools. I would have to say there's very little in curriculums that prepare kids for kind of the pragmatic and practical skills. And that's not just super, that's credit, that's budgeting, all of those sort of skills that are generally, as Eliza said, taught in the home. If you come from a background where there are those established systems and you have access to those sort of things already, if your parents are already operating in that way, then they're more likely to teach you that yourself. But schools is where we can really tackle accessibility. I guess the thing that strikes me, as well as we're talking about cracking the code on superannuation, and the way that we work is changing drastically as well. And so what we're starting to see is that young people are looking at the knowledge economy very differently. They're looking at going more into freelancing, contracting and consulting roles. They're looking at working for themselves and being self-employed. My son's 15 and he already has like a little side gig on top of his KFC gig, and KFC pays him super. The side gig certainly doesn't. And he isn't saving any of that money, and none of that money will go into superannuation because, again, as Alison said, superannuation is structured for people who are tied to long periods of employment, full-time, really secure work. What does that mean for our future generations who aren't looking at work in the same way that, Gen X, millennials generally are? And how do we support them to ensure that they're saving for retirement properly? Because the things like access to STEM, as Eliza was saying around the economics class, those things haven't changed at all. And if we're looking at kind of the trends around what roles are paying more, what technical expertise is paying more, we're looking at jobs in tech and AI and the digital industries. Those are STEM roles. They command significant compensation packages, and they are male-dominated sectors. More women are coming in through them, but they're coming in through them later. And again, those roles attract freelance and contracting kind of arrangements on the whole, because they're more lucrative than being salaried in those fields.
Yeah. There's a question on. We're sort of dealing with a lot of the pigeonhole questions. If you guessed, as we go along, one of the questions in there is, how women. When somebody asks them what their salary expectations are, it's inevitably lower than their male peer. What I always say to women is you ask for salary, at the point where you're about to burst out laughing, like how ridiculously high it is, and that's probably where we should all be starting. So we are running out of time, but I do want to end with, because we're all about solutions here, and I'm well aware we're coming up to an election. So, if you are putting forward a solution, or basically, what's your policy ask from a federal government perspective you would like to see put in place that is going to start eroding the gender wealth gap. So if you have one policy you're going to ask the federal government to put in place that's going to address this issue, what is it going to be? Can I start with you, Alison?
I might actually nominate two, but Ming, even though you said one, but I'll start with my first one.
But very quick, number two.
Well, my first one will have to be the early childhood education, and I know that's now getting a lot of traction, and that's absolutely fantastic. And it's not just affordable; it's free, because that is the only way that we're going to actually start changing it. And if we start changing it there, then we've actually got a chance we might even change financial literacy early, because it's not about financial literacy in high school; it's what's actually happening in the primary school years as well. And the second one, I just want to make a quick plug for, is social housing. I think the idea now that we all own our own homes is concerning, given the prices that we've got up. 1 in 3 people that are just taking out a mortgage have got an interest-only mortgage and don't know that they've got an interest-only mortgage. And if we're expecting to see interest rates ramp up by, 4, whatever, over to about, high 2, 3, whatever percent it's going to go to, then, my really worry is what's actually going to happen to a lot of the people that have just taken out these massive debt if they don't actually understand what they've got. So social housing, early childhood education are my two requests.
That's great, two policies. Entsar.
I'm going to stick with the brief and say one. And I think it is to publish individual organization performance on pay parity. We've just seen it happen in California. There is a very interesting kind of social effect that occurs when you have to make public your statistics. And there is an incentive then, if you want to be an employer of choice, if you want to attract and retain talent, if you want to have a values alignment with, the general kind of public and population on these sorts of issues, you will remedy quite quickly. So if there was one thing that I would change, it would be that there would be a policy where organizations at the individual levels have to publish their performance on pay parity, and we could all see it. And I would choose the employer who had the very smallest gap or the zero gap to work for when that occurred.
So can I just ask on that, the WGEA data is not enough? You're asking for more?
Yeah. It's there. It's an aggregate. It's not at the individual level. And so we can't ask the question of how an employer specifically is performing. If I am attracted to an employer and I want to negotiate my pay and I have no idea how they're performing, then I don't know which number is the number that will make me burst into laughter compared to other individuals. Knowing that up front means that there's a fair playing field at negotiation time, because we know women are less likely to negotiate the right salary or a high enough salary. Women are very good at advocating or negotiating on behalf of organizations or others. They come in top at that. They are very, very poor at negotiating at all for their own salary. And when they do negotiate, they generally don't close that parity gap.
Yeah, no, I always feel like I need to have an out-of-body experience when I'm talking about my own pay, like I'm talking about a completely
cognitive
different
dissonance.
person.
Yes, cognitive dissonance.
Eliza, your solution.
Yeah, so I think Alison kind of took mine, to be honest, but no, don't apologise. I think if I'm to go with one pragmatic, basic one that we need, it's an investment in data. It's a better understanding of ownership, the wealth gap, making surveys more regular around home ownership, pay disparity, things like that. And I think the ABS has done an amazing job amplifying some of their data sets through COVID. It'd be great to see a similar kind of response in some of the areas that we've talked about today.
Fantastic. Well, basically, out of that, we've got 3 policy positions that we can certainly, I think for the participants that are listening to this esteemed panel, you can certainly take back to your organisations or have discussions with, people within your organisations about these 3 policy positions being, sort of early childhood education and childcare. We need data. We definitely need data, and social housing as ways to actually address the gender wealth gap so that we actually start eroding this gap that is getting a lot bigger. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. And I'd really like to thank the panel, Alison, Eliza and Entsar. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise. Could I please ask everyone a favour before you log off Pigeonhole to provide your feedback and rank today's discussion? It really does help us think about what you want to hear about and what works for you. And finally, I'd like to thank our audience for your time and participation in this discussion. This discussion has been recorded and will be available shortly on the live stream link and then on the CEDA website publicly next week for you to share. And please share this with your colleagues and networks, because the best thing is actually to have a discussion, which came up a lot today. And you can also keep up to date with CEDA's program by visiting www.ceda.com.au and register for our upcoming events. But I did want to direct your attention to an event that's coming up, and we're holding in Melbourne on the 15th of March, Women Who Lead, Advocating for the Vulnerable with Grace Tame and Penny Wong. This event is in Melbourne. It will be live streamed and registrations are now open. Have a wonderful and hopefully dry rest of your day today. Thank you, everyone.